Okay, and Catherine will be on the Upper East Side later. It's not right if I don't like wave to Catherine. So hello, Catherine, and hello, people on Facebook and everybody else. Let me close chat because otherwise I'll just keep talking to you guys. Okay, good morning. Here you are for another episode of History Matters, and really so does coffee today somehow for me. As I advertised on Twitter, what I want us to talk about today, for a variety of reasons, which I'll explain in a minute, is the stories we tell about ourselves as a nation, what stories we tell and who tells them. And basically, you'll see why. There's two at least, logical reasons why I think this is important to think about now. But before I talk about those topics, it is time for me to turn to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game.
And hello, everybody. So just looks like Annie is on. So if you want your bingo cards, make sure you get into chat and get those. Welcome and thanks for being here. We're excited for another great week here. This is 68 or 67 in a row. Oh my goodness, kind of crazy.
67.
So yeah, incredible. 67. Welcome. Rules of the game are as follows. Please use chat for anything, for any conversation. We like tangents, we like links, we like all kinds of good stuff. We enjoy seeing you talk through the chat. Just please make sure to keep it family friendly and germane to the conversation. If you do have questions for Joanne as we go along, please make sure to put those in Q&A. That's where we take questions. It's a lot easier to keep track of everybody's questions and kind of shape our conversation from the Q&A, and that way I don't miss anything scrolling through chat. And as always, if you do like what we're doing here at the National Council for History Education, please join us. You can join us on the web at www.ncheteach.org and look around, join us, click the join button if you are not a member. Lots of great member benefits. A couple things that are coming up just to put on everyone's radar. We just started our second annual Critical Conversation series, I believe last night. And we have a number of webinars coming up in the next few weeks to lead into August 3rd and 4th, which is our Equity Summit. So I hope that everyone will join us for the Equity Summit, August 3rd and 4th. We have some great keynotes. Among them, we're really lucky to have Gloria Ladson-Billings with us this year to talk. So we're thrilled for that. And we have a number of other really dynamic speakers. So please join us for that. And then last, I just want to publicly just welcome, we have a new associate director, and that is Dr. Sarah Drake Brown, who's former president of NCHE. Incredible scholar, incredible human being, one of my favorite people, and I'm really excited that she will be joining us. So the Critical Conversation series can be found on our website. There should be a couple links to it. So if you can't find those, I'm sure somebody will provide the link for you, because that's how we roll here at History Matters, and so does coffee. So, and with that, I will turn it over to Joanne and Hideaway, because we can begin our day.
Okay, excellent. And I will point out that I don't know if you can hear it, but Newbie is oodling, chirping, peeping, and whatever it is. So at any rate, welcome. So talking about the stories we tell about ourselves as a nation and whose stories we tell, I will acknowledge that it came into my head in my preparation for the podcast that I recorded yesterday, the live podcast Now and Then that I did yesterday, which is on a related topic. And in preparing for it, I began thinking about the education wars that we're having right now, and the 1619 Project and the 1776 Executive Order Committee. And, I began thinking basically about the education wars that are unfortunately heating up, getting worse. And they're obviously, it's going to intensify and get worse, and this is not going to be a good thing. But I was inspired by that to talk today, because obviously those warring what do I want to call them? The different narratives of American history that are being pitted against each other obviously represent different ideologies and totally different views of the United States, different views of who we are, different views of who we've been, different views of where we can and should go. So what I wanted to talk about today is this question that the narratives, the stories we tell about ourselves as a people, as a nation, and the power that they have to define who we are, who we think we are. In my rummaging around this morning, I came across the phrase habits of thought. They create habits of thought. For all of these reasons, this is what I want to talk about today. And I'll talk a little bit here about it. And then I'll be really interested to open up the discussion because I know there are a lot of teachers here at History Matters and So Does Coffee. And this relates partly to the stories that we tell about ourselves in public history venues and museums and historic homes and public lectures, and also textbooks and in the classroom. So it's important, I think, to think about it. It's going to be, I'm sure I'm going to want to discuss it at some point again, because as I just suggested, it's going to get much, much worse. And this is the second reason why I thought I would initiate this today. I received lots of information or saw lots of things floating around since July 4th about the fact that our next, it's not bicentennial, but the 250th anniversary, put it that way, of our original signing of the Declaration of Independence is coming, right? And people are beginning to talk about it's coming, you know, there are commissions and committees discussing what should happen and websites being formed and all of these people trying to think about what should happen for the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, obviously that's going to be a period of some major storytelling. Some of it, well, it'll be interesting to see, you know, because obviously that kind of moment is a celebration. And I think it's possible to celebrate and be realistic at the same time. I think for some, it will probably be easier just to celebrate and not think about anything except pretty balloons. But regardless, we're going to be seeing, in addition to the ideological warfare over education, more warfare over, and as I said, increasingly over the next few years, what is happening for this coming commemoration of American history. Now, you know, I thought when I was thinking about this morning, I tried to think back to the bicentennial, which was one of the big things that helped get me interested in history. And I tried to think about, because I was, I don't know, 13, 14. I see someone just said semi-quincentennial. Okay, that was not on the tip of my tongue. I was trying to remember how I thought about the message of the bicentennial, the narrative that it was telling, little, you know, 13 or 14-year-old me. And one of the things I said yesterday was, on the one hand, I remember how excited I was about it because it made history come to life in a way that I'd never thought about before. So just the simple fact that it was everywhere and historic homes and all these local historic sites. I was in Yorktown Heights, New York at the time. Suddenly people were talking about this happened here during the revolution. In all kinds of ways, the revolution and the lead up to the revolution seemed to be everywhere. And I had never thought of, I don't think I'd thought about history that much really at all, but certainly I had never thought about it as being that immediate. So that was the message I took away. I'm sure that at the time, some part of me had a sort of flag wavy, you know, yay America response. I don't remember. I do remember, as I said last night, that at the same time that I was very excited about the bicentennial, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in my town, and I was being really, how do I even want to put it? It was really unpleasant to be Jewish, and I was being told again and again and again that I didn't belong. So those things are happening at the same time. And in many ways, that's an American story too. But I think whatever happens in the bicentennial or the sesquicentennial, I've already lost the word. The coming celebration is going to be a big deal. And just looking around at what's happening now, you can see how that's going to be a big deal. Now, we've talked here on History Matters and So Does Coffee before about talking about American history and about the importance of acknowledging bad and good, that history has never been and is never just a story of golden heroes doing wonderful, glorious things, that American history is a story of ambiguity and struggle and opportunity and denial, and that you can't tell the story without all of the colors, and I don't mean that in any kind of a punny way, all of the colors and every meaning possible of our history, all of the ways, all of the aspects of it, the shadows and the light points of our history. That's who we are. And whether we choose to acknowledge that or not is a separate question. Regardless of what we do, that's who we are. And if we want to understand who we are and work towards something better, we need to think about our real history, which is, again, part of why people are really getting ready to battle over what stories we tell about ourselves in educational sites and classrooms and other such sites, because that is not only going to shape where we are right now, but it's an aim to shape the future. Now, when I was rummaging around to get ready for this morning, I came across two things that I thought were interesting. I'm going to mention them, and then I'll go on to talk a little bit more broadly. I came across a reference to something that Barack Obama, former President Obama, said in 2009. And I guess he was in Istanbul. It was his first official trip to Europe as president. And he admitted in this address that the United States had made mistakes in the past, that certainly there were flaws in the past of the United States. And a few days before that, at a NATO press conference, he said that American exceptionalism was no different from British exceptionalism or Greek exceptionalism, and that America would no longer be making unilateral, bombastic decisions that would affect the globe under the guise of American exceptionalism. And not surprisingly, there was a huge blowback for that statement. Now, I've talked before about, and certainly on Twitter, I don't know if I've talked here about it, the problems with the idea of American exceptionalism. And I'm not saying that there are things that are admirable about where we come from as a nation and the possibilities that we opened as a nation. But exceptionalism, in the way that Americans often use it, suggests that we're kind of a perfect nation and that nothing bad can happen to us and that whatever we do is right. And that because we're different from every other nation on earth, the rules don't apply to us. And I've been howling in one way or another on Twitter and everywhere else. That's a dangerous thing to be thinking right now, because I'm going to say the word, I say it every week, contingency, right? Things are highly contingent right now. We don't know what's going to happen. And if we assume everything is going to be all right, that's a dangerous thing to be thinking right now. We need to be aware of the fact that things can go in any direction, in directions that we aren't anticipating or that we don't want to anticipate. And we really need to think about that and be aware of that and do what we can to move things in a positive direction, to be more inclusive, to respond to the warfare, the ideological warfare that's going on around us in a way that is using the present moment to build towards something better, and thus is looking at history in a responsible, mature, inclusive way to build towards that future. So that's what former President Obama was referencing, right? That idea of American exceptionalism, he didn't say it this explicitly, but that it can be dangerous, and that in a sense, every country has a sense of itself as exceptional. You can also see why many people would object to that the United States somehow is like a city on a hill that's different from everywhere else. However, the other thing that I found rummaging around this morning has to do with something that happened recently. And this is from a story from 2013. So I don't know how recent is. But at some point in the semi-recent past, Russian President Putin asked historians to develop, quote, a history curriculum that would produce a single history free from internal contradictions and ambiguities. Okay. So a history that is free from internal contradictions and ambiguities is not history, right? What is history but a series of human decisions grounded in mistakes and misperceptions and unknowingness and contingency again? The struggle and the unknowingness and the contingency of the moment. That's what history is all about. So if you're constructing a narrative that has no contradictions, no ambiguities, by definition, that's false. It's safe and comfortably solid if you're trying to ground the nation in one particular narrative of what it has been, and thus trying to create a one block version of what the nation will be in the future. That's what's at stake with this. And again, it makes sense that in Russia, that would be a very concrete way of looking at things. Here, you know, it's what people are doing, but some of them couch it, like the 1776 project and committee, you know, we need to really celebrate the great things about America. What they're not saying is we need to have one positive view of America because blah, blah, blah. But that's essentially what's happening there. So, you know, American history, human history, is by definition a story of internal contradictions, ambiguities. The human condition is us struggling to figure out what to do in a given moment, to deal with the opportunities that are available to us, to be trapped by opportunities that are not available to us, to deal with conflicting ideologies. It's the struggle, it's the conflict that defines where we end up as a nation. Eliminate the ugly, eliminate the struggle, and you eliminate essentially the making of this nation. That to me is a pretty serious crime in the understanding of any history, and particularly American history. Now, in the classroom, this is shaped in obvious ways, partly through the choice of books and textbooks that people are using, you know, in a way, and as a historian, I suppose I shouldn't necessarily, I'm not even sure if I believe this. You know, as I was writing this, all over the notes I created, I have the word narrative. What narrative are we telling about American history? Which is a, you know, a tinged word, because on the one hand, it suggests we're making up stories, but we do create narratives of our history in one way or another. And so the question is, what narrative do we tell? As part of that narrative, you know, and we've seen some discussions of public-minded history. That's going to be more of that as the next celebration of, you know, wonderful anniversary of July 4th comes up in 2026. We'll be looking at things like what historic sites are getting played up, what historic sites will the government point to as being significant on that occasion, what stories will be told at and about those sites. Though that seemingly simple and seemingly minimal idea can have a huge impact. And the thing that comes to mind for me, which is obvious, but I'm going to mention it anyway, I'm on the board of the National Center for Jefferson Studies, which exists. And as part of that, we learn every year at our board meeting what Monticello is doing, because it's right down the road from Monticello, what Monticello is doing in their interpretation for the public. And one of the major changes in the last, I don't know, decade, maybe a little more than that, at Monticello has been the weaving of the enslaved community and slavery into the major story about what's being told at Monticello. There was resistance to that. There were some trustees, I'm sure, who were upset by it. There were certainly Jefferson descendants who were not thrilled with this. Others were very supportive of it, but that's a very different view of Monticello, just including all of this surrounding humanity and struggle and action in the telling of Monticello. Before that, you could go to Monticello, and I'm sure I did before that was really, before it certainly had anything to do with the institution, and before, you know, even the Sally Hemings story was out in the open for people to consider. You know, you go to Monticello, and what you would see is you would be taken around the inside of the house, and you would see the entryway with the Native American artifacts, and you would see Jefferson's study and his books, and you would see his bed and the parlor in which he hung all of these portraits in hierarchical order of some kind that made sense to him. You would see all of these things. If you looked out of the windows, what you saw was rolling countryside beneath what you could see. So basically, slightly below the ground level were all of the slave quarters. Underneath Monticello was the kitchen and other things where, you know, other rooms where the enslaved population was working to keep Monticello running. So basically you could go through at that time a tour of that house and have no sign of slavery at all. And it's a plantation. So that's problematic. So that fact in and of itself is really striking. And that's a great example of a narrative being very deliberately changed to change our understanding of Jefferson, and because he's so central to American history, to change our understanding of the founding and America, not in a way to say that everything American is horrible, but in a way to say that this is us. This was us. We have to acknowledge that to get past it. If we ignore it, we're living it. So that's a great example of the kinds of shifts, and the shifts for Monticello meant slightly changing what's said during tours. It meant reconstructing some of the slave quarters so that people could see them and be inside them. It meant reconstructing and allowing people to see the working quarters beneath the beautiful plantation up above about what was happening. It meant changing the story being told at Monticello, making it more inclusive, and in doing so, changing our understanding of Jefferson and the founding. So what historic sites are going to get highlighted and talked about? What stories are going to be told at them? What kind of evidence is going to be used to tell those stories is another thing that will be interesting to see, right? Because as someone who writes a lot, as a historian who writes a lot about elite dead white guys, I have the luxury of having very often written formal evidence, letters and reports and diaries, and you know, these people leave behind these kinds of artifacts, very carefully saved these kinds of artifacts. Their descendants ordered these kinds of artifacts, and they were kept because these were important people. So I have a certain kind of evidence. If you're telling other stories about anyone who isn't an elite white person, it's harder to tell that story. Not impossible, but harder, because you need to search for different kinds of evidence. You need to look in census records and court records. You need to look for information about people within the letters and statements of elite white men or elite white women. You need to find ways to pull out the strands of people around those people in that more conventional correspondence. You need to look at material culture, objects that tell stories. You have to be more creative to tell those stories. Those stories need to be told, but not only do you have to be more creative, but you have to acknowledge and think past the gaps and holes in archives. So, you know, I think we think of archives and libraries as just holding mass amounts of things. Actually, the same is true for databases. They're just storage places. But when you think about the fact that any library, any archive represents, at some point, someone's view of what was important to be saved, and its organization and ordering represents a particular view of what matters and how it matters and who matters and what information is available and what makes sense in referencing it, in finding it. So archives are not huge objective masses of evidence. They tell stories too. And there are enormous gaps in archives that often I think it's easy to forget about depending on what you're looking at. Again, if you're looking at populations that aren't elite and aren't white, the gaps in these archives are yawning, right? They're enormous. The same thing holds true, and I don't think I've talked about this before, but I think about it a lot. So between my first book and my second book, databases really came into their own, databases of historical information. My first book, I didn't have real databases. So I was just rummaging, flipping newspaper pages and looking in bibliographies and doing what one does before there were these databases. Now there are huge databases, newspapers and people's letters, and that's wonderful and amazing. And it means I could sit at my desk and punch in a word like honor or duel or affair of honor, and all of this stuff comes up, and it would have taken me months to do it, and now I can do it in an hour. But the problem with databases refers to and connects with what I was just saying about archives. Databases aren't complete. They're subjective. They represent maybe what an institution has at hand, or maybe a particular collection of institutions that decided to create a database together, or things that actually were easy to digitize, to put in a database. There are gaping holes in databases that we don't see. And because they, you know, I can sit down and go to the database, America's Historical Newspapers, which I use all the time, right? And it's, I don't even know how many, it's a vast number of newspapers. And I can sit there and come up with amazing information. But what I don't think about, well, now I do now, but when I first started using it, and I've now stressed it with my students, is what isn't there. And I discovered that, you know, really early on, I assigned something to my students, maybe 20 something years ago when I was first at Yale. And I wanted them to go to that database and find an event that was reported in one particular newspaper and another particular newspaper, and to see how those reports differed as a way of looking at how politics affects how people understood what was happening in their world. And what I discovered, the students were very quick to tell me, is that one of the newspapers was in that database and the other one wasn't. And so the students were like, well, we don't know what's in the other one. We can't, how do we know what's in the other one? Like, we can't do this assignment. Now, the other one's on microfilm. It's in the library, right? And so I had to say, well, you know, it's not on the database, but it actually is there. And most of these students had never used microfilm. But again, there's a case in which if you had been looking up something, you would have gotten a lot of views in one way, and you would have been missing some conflicting, very conflicting views, because certain newspapers were not in that database. So anyway, that's a detailed way of saying the evidence that we have to tell the stories that we tell also is scattered and diffuse and random. And so when we think about the stories that we tell and whose stories we tell and whose voices are included in the telling, right? Who is in our history, which needs to be broad and inclusive, because we as a nation are and should be a broad and inclusive people, regardless of some people who do not think we should be. The fact of the matter is we are and need to be better at embodying that. But again, dealing with all kinds of challenges of evidence and historical content, the problem of evidence, where I wrote that down on my notes. It says the problem of evidence. And I thought, well, we are in the age of the problem of evidence, right? We're living in this age where what is evidence? Who believes evidence? What evidence is believable? Where can you find evidence? How can you tell between what's true and false? We are in a crisis of evidence. And it's yet another way in which history and our understanding of the past is front and center, because if you're struggling with evidence and you're struggling with people who don't believe evidence, even if it's real, again, you're struggling with an understanding of the present and how to convince people of an understanding of what actually happened in the past. I'm going to open things for questions in a moment. The last thing I want to mention, and it's just actually, and I know you guys are like, you're so fast. That's the mug is coming. The mug is coming. I see that. I actually thought about it. I wrote down on my notes, mug. So I'm trying to remember year 2. But the thing I also wanted to mention, I just stumbled across it. But for those of you who are interested in some of the ideas that I'm discussing here this morning, one of the books that I was looking at is titled Our American Story: The Search for a Shared National Narrative, edited by Joshua Claiborne, Claybourn, which looks, I didn't have the whole book at my disposal. It's a collection of essays, but like David Blight writes an essay and Gordon Wood writes an essay. It's really interesting people talking about America's national narrative and what it has been and what it can be. So it looks like a really interesting collection. So I'll mention it again because I know one of you will find it and make a link. Our American Story: The Search for a Shared National Narrative, right on topic. Okay, before I open things up, because I really want to have a discussion about this today, the mug. And this one is really obvious. And as I was doing it this morning, I was like, some of you guys out there are even going to know the mug that's coming, but there's no way I could not do this mug.
I was right.
Who tells your story? How could I not use this mug?
I thought maybe you would use that one.
I even yesterday when I was, so I thought of the topic, I thought about the kinds of things I wanted to say. And I was like, what mug will I, it's like, duh. Who tells our story? So this was the easiest mug week I probably ever have, because sometimes, as you well know, who come here all the time, there's some mighty long stretches for me to yoke a mug in. If there's anyone new out there, every week I find a mug that has something to do with what we're talking about, and sometimes it isn't quite on target. And the other thing we do every week is that Matt has a background that relates to what we're discussing. And I don't know if folks are trying to guess.
I have not seen a guess, and if you get it, I would be astounded, because I went a long way for this one this week. So so my background is inspired by, believe it or not, the Indigo Girls song Virginia Woolf, which is a lovely tribute to Virginia Woolf. But it among the ideas in it is this idea that we can communicate with people throughout time, and find inspiration and friendship with people in the past. So with that in mind, this is Virginia Woolf's bedroom at the Monk House.
I've never seen that before. A room of her own.
Thank you. I think it's John Cummings on Wikipedia for this picture. But this is that's what this is. So this is from Virginia Woolf's house.
Very cool.
Like I said, I went a long way this week.
You did, but it works. And you're getting rave reviews. So thumbs up, thumbs up on the background. Okay. I want to open things up for question, because I know that this directly affects a lot of you who are watching. And I will talk about it, but I want you to talk about it with each other too. So let's see if we can have a real conversation here, because as I suggested, it's an important one. It's going to get more important as this, 2026 celebration comes rolling on. Boy, is this question of the stories that we tell in our national narrative going to lunge up and jump on us. So
I'm going to start with Dale's question, which is, a colleague of mine at Colonial Williamsburg likes to say that Americans can hold two contradictory ideas in mind at one time. How does that impact the stories that we tell ourselves? Americans can hold two contradictory ideas in mind at one time. How does that impact the stories that we can tell ourselves?
Well, I think everyone can do that, right? I don't think that's just American. And I don't think all Americans want to do that, right? So I agree. I think that we can have different stories in our head at one time. In a way, what matters is the connection between the two. So yeah, you can have one story that's about the founding and the experiment in government, and a more democratic government and something different from the old world and blah blah blah. And you can have another story about the nation and even the pre-nation, the colonies being grounded on slavery, right? So those are very contradictory ideas. They're both there. And what matters is the way that you acknowledge that they're both there at the same time. And that's what matters, is the connection. So, I think the fact that we can think about two stories at the same time is important, because it's how we have to deal with history, right? Some people who are nervous about a more realistic history that includes flaws and problems is somehow some of the people who talk about that are nervous that in acknowledging bad, it's just erasing all good, which it isn't, right? I don't think like America is evil and has always been evil. I think, well, it did some good things and opened some good doors, and then it didn't walk through them. So, okay, like let's work towards being what we could be and what we haven't yet been. Those are different stories that in a sense are being brought into one story. I think that's important. So Dale's question, I think, is pointing to something that we kind of have to do, right? That's the responsible thing to do, and that not everyone wants to do. And people can sort of caricature people who are willing to accept the bad, right? Caricature it as being all bad or only bad. And that's not what it is.
So on a related note, something specific related to that, which is Dave's question, which says, any thoughts on the book Forget the Alamo and the reaction to it? What story do Texans tell themselves today versus? And so,
well, that's yet another thing that yesterday when I was pondering what to talk about in the podcast, of course, the Alamo was one of the things that came up. And that's yet another clear-cut example of the sort of thing I'm talking about with, 1776 and the shiny, happy narrative, and then 1619, a more mature, complex narrative, right? That we're seeing that play out with the Alamo, and particularly Texans who have a very strong sense of who they are.
Visceral.
I was going to say, it's an understatement, right? So Texans talk about having a narrative. They have a very strong narrative, and the Alamo in many ways is at the center of it. So someone stepping forward and saying, Alamo story is more complicated than you think, on the one hand, is a good thing to do and would get people, and I think now probably more people are reading that book than were before this controversy, gets people to think about, again, realities that unfold and the stories, the myths and stories we tell about ourselves. That's a great conversation. But, it's also brought forth these people who are literally trying to just close the door on that complexity. And in a sense, I think it's good for people to see people blocking out possibility, right? Not because I think it's good to block out possibility, but people stepping forward and saying, we're not allowed to talk about that book because it makes things look bad and we don't think they're bad. That's a kind of exposure of a kind of thinking that is not healthy. So, in a sense, that controversy hopefully is making some people think about the ways in which some myths are preserved. And that is by, blocking out, walling off any ambiguity or conversation or possibility, just any opportunity to talk about what really happened and what that means.
So Maria asks, the idea that a slaveholder had children with one of his enslaved women doesn't seem that far-fetched to me. Why are so many historians resistant to the idea? What was at stake for them? Why was it so difficult for them to reconcile the idea that Jefferson was the father of Sally Hemings' children?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, that's interesting. I think part of that has to do with who Jefferson represents to people. If you have a golden, beautiful founding in the Declaration and it's only good, Jefferson, the author or one of the main authors of the Declaration of Independence, and in many ways, I always refer to him as like the poet of the Revolution, because he had a way of putting things in a language that people wanted to own, even though he readily said, I'm not making up the ideas, but the way he said them matters. So he kind of stands as this towering figure that represents and has given us American ideals. And for that person to be engaged in a sexual relationship with an enslaved person for all kinds of reasons, that punctures a myth that people felt very strongly about. So it had to do with sort of knocking Jefferson off a pedestal. And part of the reaction was evidence of how high that pedestal was, right? That people really, and still really, can't acknowledge that. And it's partly about the pedestal. It's partly about racism, right? They just don't want to acknowledge that. And, people, it's both of those things. So when people step forward and say, a lot of enslavers in one way or another, either raped or had sex with the enslaved people that they lived with, people can say, yeah, okay, but not Jefferson. So it's both of those things together. But it's a great example of just a need to preserve a myth and deny a reality. That's what was so useful about Annette Gordon Reed's book, The Hemings of Monticello, is that she brought to life the people who were there around Jefferson and made it evident that what we assumed was true in a kind of human way. And she toyed with and explored the implications of that. So that's what I think it is. I think it's kind of like the Alamo. It's people smacking at something that is so fundamentally a part of what people assume is who we are, that people have a guttural kind of reaction to someone taking, not even a swipe at it, to someone being willing to say, maybe let's take it off the pedestal and actually look at it at eye level.
So getting into the conversations about critical race theory that are happening now, Tim wants to know, one common critique is that teaching critical history is fueling quote unquote divisiveness. How would you recommend educators respond to that claim?
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say is K through 12 teachers are not teaching critical race theory. They aren't. It's a form of legal history. That's where it came about. It's about structures. It's about the fact that there are structures built into the United States that are inherently racist, and acknowledging that and looking how that works. So first of all, the idea that critical race theory is being taught all over America in elementary schools is just not true. That has become a shorthand, a kind of cultural shorthand for race, right? And for encouraging people to not talk about race because it's a divisive issue. Mm-hmm. I do think that there are conversations that are hard to have. They're harder to have if people deny that they exist, right? So I don't think it's divisive necessarily to acknowledge that slavery was in our past, that it says something about us, and that we need to grow beyond that. This isn't necessarily divisive. It's divisive if there are people saying, no, like, it wasn't there, it never happened. How can you say that? It's bad, bad, bad. So it becomes divisive because of the way we respond to it. I think it's not inherently divisive in and of itself. That said, I don't have a brilliant solution for the fact that at a moment when race and racism are really front and center in how we're talking about and understanding ourselves, it becomes by definition a divisive issue, because it touches on the hot point of the current moment, and that's race and racism.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's hard to offer teachers like sort of this is what you say, because one of the important things to recognize is that each sort of situation is contextual, right? Like, you know, what the way that this issue is manifesting is different in different places around the country. And so, you know, one of the things that I would recommend, just to insert myself into this conversation a little bit, is that you might simply go to the facts of whatever is actually happening in schools and simply say, this is what we do. You know, and walk through that process. Because I agree. I mean, and even teachers who are practicing anti-racist teaching are not teaching critical race theory.
No, that's become an equivalent of commie.
Yeah,
it's become a word that just is intended to other people.
Yes,
and to draw a line in the sand and say, you know, you're one of them. You're one of them. I was. I don't remember when I talked about this recently. It might have been on the podcast. It might have been here, but it was a moment that this stood out to me. And it was, I don't know how many years ago, Shakespeare in the Park here in New York did Julius Caesar. Did I talk about that here?
No, but okay. Well, I don't remember. Continue.
Okay. If I did, I apologize in advance. It was Caesar, Julius Caesar, but it was from a Trump point of view. So Caesar was Trump.
Yeah.
Did we talk about it? Okay.
I feel like we talked about this like in our early episodes.
It could be.
Let's revisit
here. The point that I'm driving at is I saw it. I thought it was interesting. I tweeted something out saying, well, that was really interesting. And someone responded by saying, commie. And I remember standing in the subway and I was like, commie? You know, I was like, how? I don't, huh? And, you know, that was what we're doing now in many ways, was just, you know, you're one of them who's willing to say bad things about, and what can we call bad people? Commie, you know, it was so, it got me in kind of a guttural way, how desperately people were grabbing at something to say evil, you know, without being that obvious as saying evil.
I do not think it means what you think it means.
That's exactly, it actually has a meaning. So, yeah.
So continuing on with this conversation, Kathleen asks, the pushback on education I hear from those upset about critical race theory is that, quote unquote, the danger lies in this continuation of defining people by color of their skin, that racism isn't an overwhelming problem in the United States, end quote. And then believing that people are fighting the ideology built on, quote, if you are white, you necessarily have privilege, end quote, and that the US curriculum reflects all of this. Can you address these perceptions? How do we address these perceptions?
That the idea that if you're white, you have a certain amount of privilege in our society?
Yeah, and there's a danger in continuing to define people and history through the lens of race, and that it's not an overwhelming problem in the United States.
Well, it's not an overwhelming problem.
I'm just reading. I'm not critiquing.
Right.
I promise.
If you are watching anything that happens in the news in the last however many years, I don't think you can deny that it's a problem. People can argue over what the nature of the problem is, but the fact of the matter is it's very obvious that Americans in one way or another are arguing over race, the place of racism, the place of slavery. How do we talk about it? Do we talk about it? How do we educate people with it? I mean, in one way or another, all of those things are questions and controversies because people right now are at a moment where they're reckoning with big questions of race, big structural questions, right? That's the other thing about critical race theory is it doesn't say like all white people are racist. It's actually not about individual people at all, right? It's about structures that are racist in their implications. So, I think the more people fuss about critical race theory, the more they prove that race is at the center of where we are right now. And it's hard for me to think of a way to deny that because I think it's really, really evident and in our faces. But I think if you're saying that race isn't a big part of who we are, you're really not kind of looking at what's going on around us with a, what do I want to say, objective lens. I just think it's kind of obvious. And there are different, there are people on the right saying something about race. There are people on the extreme left saying something about, there's a spectrum of views and there's an extreme on both sides. And in some ways, the extreme on both sides, they have different problems, but there are some problems there. But it is the issue. It is the issue.
Well, we have about 10 minutes left, so let's turn our attention really briefly to a couple other issues that you had raised. One of them, Tim is asking about the National Register of Historic Places. He says, how might the National Register of Historic Places play a role in our teaching and how we tell our stories?
Oh, that's interesting.
Have those responsible for the National Register created resources for teachers?
That's interesting. Well, some of you might know about resources, but that's a really interesting approach to things, which would be looking with students at how things are commemorated or not, what's included or what's not included. For example, you could do a better version of what I did briefly here, which is how did people celebrate the bicentennial? Like, what did the government do? Like, what topics and events did they highlight? And what does that say about how people were thinking about the United States at the time? That doesn't have to be, I'm not saying that to suggest it's a big judgment passing exercise, but just a historical evidence exercise. What were the main things people seemed interested in? What were they saying about those things? What can we tell? And that relates to the question of what is included as something historical that's on a historical register, what is included, what isn't included, and what does that say about what we're valuing or not valuing at a given time? That's a really interesting, different kind of a way and I think interesting way to teach history, which is to look at how we tell our history as a way of understanding our history, right? That actually would be fun, just a double level. And also at the same time, something we've talked about here a lot, which is, and so many of you are already doing this and knowing this, which is how important it is to talk about evidence and finding evidence and what is evidence and what counts as evidence and thinking about and evaluating evidence, since we're in the crisis of that too right now.
Becky wants to know, so turning our attention to this 250th anniversary, I'm not sure we came up with the correct word because there's different words that convey.
Yeah, I didn't try because I knew I was going to get the wrong one. So
yeah. Becky wants to know, in the run up to the 250th, is it reasonable to include the viewpoint of the English and French and others for the same period to help balance the sense of exceptionalism?
Well, I think it's useful and only semi-recent that people have talked about American history in the context of the world, right? That I think American historians for a while were very focused on the United States and didn't really look around beyond it. I think it's important to recognize that the United States is within the world. So yeah, I do think that that would be interesting and important. There's David Armitage did a book, I think, on the Declaration of Independence and how it's viewed and understood around the world. That's a great example of this kind of thing, which is a world context matters hugely, right? I mean, it's kind of like saying there's nothing bad in the past, suggesting that the United States somehow exists in space and time in a little bubble all by itself doesn't work. So, and particularly nowadays when, we are in a hyper global time, and by that, I mean, look at the pandemic, which is basically telling us no barriers matter, man, because this doesn't care what nation you're in. Mm-hmm. This doesn't care what people you are. This is just going to, it's global. It's going to affect all of us. And if we were to act together in some way, boy, that would be a fine way to eliminate the pandemic, which of course will never happen. But I think that's important to talk about America's place in the world, in the past and in the present. So yeah, a great example of this, it's minor, but it really struck me at the time. My American Revolution course, big lecture course, and there was a student in the front row, like right in front of me in the front row, who was British, who I knew, but I didn't think about it. I'm talking about the revolution and I try really hard. Like I talk about what the British thought and what they thought they were doing, what the Americans thought. And so I'm not waving flags around in my revolution course. Then I got to the Battle of Yorktown, and I'm talking about how important the battle was and how the Americans were waiting for the French ships to help, really sort of end that battle. And I suppose without thinking about it, I was talking about it as, look what happened, the American and the French. And I talked about the surrender at Yorktown and what a big deal people made of it, blah, blah, blah. This British student came up to me at the end and he said, let me get this straight. So a small group of British soldiers at Yorktown, isolated and backed into a corner with very few supplies, enormously outnumbered, held off the American and French armies for how many days? And I was like, yes, indeed. And because of that question, I very aggressively in future versions of that course worked in like what people are saying in Parliament at a given moment, the fact that the British themselves were conflicted and disagreed over what was going on in the United States. It was an obvious thing, but it wasn't until this very well-meaning student with a sense of humor, but also seriously said, I'm sitting in the front row and I've got a different story. So that's worth thinking about too. I don't know how many years ago that was, but obviously I still remember it.
Yeah, no. And I, it's one of those things I'm acutely aware of with my work is how national centric we are, in the way that we think about history. We think very deliberately about the American story and the American experience, and this, which is all wonderful and valid, but it's only one part of that story. So I'm going to go off script here for a second, ask you a question, which is, what would, to avoid that, what would you love to see the America 250 project do to tell the more complete story
of the American Revolution?
Yeah.
That was the age of revolution.
Okay.
So the American, we of course need to talk about everything that was happening at the time in the United States, because it's that revolution that's being commemorated, but it's an age of revolution. It's taught that way. There are endless books and departments and things that are structured around that. How interesting would it be to say, let's look at the American Revolution and let's look at it with other revolutions happening at the same time. And what does that tell us about the American one, right? That's useful. That's a good kind of a question to ask. Now, that said, years and years and years ago, I took part, every once in a while, there's like a seminar or something that you're invited to, and you're like, how is this my life? This was in the south of France in some resort town. And it was like, right, a dozen early American historians. And we had a book full of primary sources about the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And our job was to stay in the south of France for a week and talk about the two revolutions and see what we could, I know, exactly, it was horrible, see what we could pull out as far as similarities and differences beyond the really obvious ones that people talk about, a social revolution, a political revolution, blah, blah, blah. We really worked for all of that time. And in the end, we didn't have a new telling. We were like, we came away kind of where we started, which was interesting. And these were, I was probably either in grad school or a brand new baby professor, but, like big name historians were there, and political scientists. And I was sort of watching them and thinking, well, I don't feel so bad now about not being able to pull the bigger lesson. But that fact in and of itself would be interesting. So I think that's I don't know how that will work or if it will work. And I'll bet a lot of people aren't thinking about it. But the fact that what happened in the United States happened in an age of revolutions means that we should think about what was happening around the world at that moment. And that the United States wasn't alone in that phenomenon.
Well, I just have one more question about the America 250, which is, it's from Miranda, but I actually share in it too, because we are both bicentennial babies. And so her question is there a way that you and Heather can cancel the 250th anniversary? Because that means that we'll be turning 50 that year, and we're not okay with that. So if you two could cancel the America 250 so that we don't have to turn 50. That's
no, 50 is good, guys.
50 is good. Okay.
50 is good. 60 is a little scary. I'm approaching that. I don't know what I'm going to do about that, but the 50s are excellent. So don't be scared of the 50. I can say, and I say that. Perfect. So, because women have other issues with actually, so this is totally random, has nothing to do with anything, but it made me feel good. Somewhere online or somewhere, someone said they had a friend who was agonizing over whether they should dye their hair or not in their 50s, because now they were going gray. And at some point in that conversation, someone said, well, Joanne Freeman doesn't dye her hair. And I was like, yes! The 50s don't have to be bad, right? You can go gray. You can be proud and grow gray. Very off script, but anyway. We are coming up to the end of our time. So let me explain to those who are new here what happens next. We now segue into the after party. What that means is we do not record what happens next. It's more casual and more freewheeling, and we really engage in a fun conversation with each other. If you came in through the website online, NCHE teach.org/conversations, you could just stay here and it will become the after party. If you're on Facebook and watching us on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and enter again by clicking that link at ncheteach.org/conversations. Anyone can join, but you can't get there through Facebook. Okay, so as always, I will thank everyone for being here because it matters. And it matters more now than it has, I don't know, at some time past. It really matters that we're having this discourse at a time when it's going to affect now and future. I hope I will see you next week. And I swear every week I'm going to figure out what we're talking about before Thursday. I don't do it. But I swear again, I will try to figure out what the topic next week will be before Thursday. I hope I will see you all then. I hope you will bring your friends, bring your family, come along for next week's episode. And I hope everybody has a good week.
And before we go, can I just say out loud, thank you, Joanne, for leading this conversation this week. It's important to have leaders of your caliber willing to have this conversation. And I know we all benefit from that. So thank you for your time. This has really been super helpful, and this is a time of great contingency as we talk about. And we're grateful for your voice. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, man. That's really nice of you to say. Thank you.
All right. Now we're gonna go have some fun, dry our tears, and we'll transition to the after party. Thanks everybody for coming, and we will see you all next week.